Thank you for tuning in to our best practices for virtual assessment session. We're excited to hear from Lucy Gettle. Ms. Gettle is a clinical dietitian specialist and QI coordinator at the UVA Adult CF Center. She received her undergraduate degree from Penn State University, did her internship at the University of Virginia, and received her master's from the University of Kansas. Ms. Gettle has a wealth of telehealth experience. She serves as the team QI leader for the CF Learning Network Telehealth Innovation Lab. Her team has published 2 articles on the CF telehealth model since COVID began. We look forward to hear what Ms. Gettle has to share today.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda, for that introduction. And I am excited to talk to you all about best practices for CF virtual nutrition assessments today. So to get started, I do not have any relationships to disclose related to this presentation. And we're going to be starting off briefly with understanding the scope of telehealth in nutrition overall in the nutrition world. We're going to review survey responses from dietitians as well as patients and family members regarding their CF virtual nutrition experiences. And then we're going to talk about best practices and opportunities for optimizing CF virtual nutrition assessments. So to begin, I just want to take a step back and remind us all that even though for many CF dietitians, probably for most CF dietitians, telehealth is a new experience, it actually has been around the nutrition world for a very long time, to the extent that there's actually terminology from the Academy for this. And there's a term called telenutrition, which is new to me as I was preparing for this presentation. And that refers to implementing the nutrition care process through a telehealth platform. And there have been a variety of studies conducted on telenutrition. A lot of them had to do with, or the patient population tended to be rural, underserved populations. So I wasn't able to find much research, or actually I wasn't able to find any comparing in person with telehealth the way that we're navigating now. But I believe that that will be to come, as many dietitians are now experiencing telehealth. And so why does this all matter now? As we said, telehealth has been going on for a very long time for some dietitians, and I've seen estimates of maybe about 30% or so of dietitians were using telehealth before. But now, because of COVID and the social distancing recommendations, it's actually a majority phenomenon. So probably most of us in this watching this presentation have done some form of telehealth because of COVID with our patients. And the recommendations may continue into 2022. We don't know what the future holds in that regard. And why this matters is that we can't afford to just press pause and wait for everything to go back to normal. We have to find a new normal for delivering good quality nutrition care in the midst of the pandemic. And the other thing is that a lot of patients have actually reported liking telemedicine, and they want it to continue in some capacity even after COVID. So there's a good chance that telehealth might be here to stay for the long haul in the CF world, especially given the precautions we normally have even outside of CF and the very vibrant online community that our community has. And so I want to take some time just to review what people's experiences have been so far. And so what have CF dietitians said about virtual visits? Well, I want to thank the 66 dietitians who completed this survey that was distributed on the listserv. And as you can see, most of the respondents were pediatric dietitians. There were some adult respondents as well as both pediatric and adult populations that they work with. There are a variety of different telehealth platforms used, and I was surprised to see that it seems there's multiple platforms being used by dietitians, because we had far more responses than the number of participants. And so as you can see, there's a variety of ways we can do this. And as of right now, in light of the COVID pandemic, Medicare has lifted the restrictions on which platforms dietitians are allowed to use for telehealth. And so that really opens up a lot of flexibility. And so what did y'all say about your experience of virtual nutrition visits? And the majority, or about half or so, felt that the quality wasn't as good as in-person visits. But 40% also said it wasn't necessarily better or worse, just different. And there was a small minority, 9%, that actually reported feeling that virtual visits were better than in-person visits. And so why would it be worse, or what were some of the challenges? As you can see, the most commonly reported thing, and we've heard this in the listserv and various Blue Jeans calls during this time, is not having anthropometric measurements, not having accurate height and weight, not having the ability to do body composition. And so that was the most common complaint. Or maybe patients have a scale at home, but just feeling like self-reported weights weren't as accurate. That was also a comment that I saw several times. And then followed by that, tech and connectivity issues on the patient's end, then not having lab results, and not being able to do a nutrition-focused physical exam or see the patient's full body. So these were kind of the most common concerns that people were experiencing. And there are a few other ones below that were less reported. And I circled these in red because since they're the most common, we're going to be circling back to them at the end of the presentation to talk about what are some strategies we can employ to navigate these challenges. So on the flip side, what are some advantages of CF virtual nutrition assessments according to dietitians? The most commonly reported advantage was the ability to be able to see a patient's home environment, including the ability to for patients to grab their vitamin bottles or medications if they can't remember exactly what they're taking, for them to show you their pantry and their kitchen, and you can have that conversation with the food right in front of them. And that has allowed for a more thorough assessment. And so that was very commonly reported. The second most commonly reported thing was more time with patients. And so I do say this with a caveat because there are some who reported they felt like they had less time with patients in virtual nutrition assessments, but more happened to have more time. And then patients and families seem to be more relaxed and comfortable during the virtual visits and willing to open up. And it's more convenient and less stressful for patients and families not having to park or travel. And then a few other comments about being able to see patients that don't normally come to clinic or refuse to see the dietitian when they come to clinic normally. Now they're able to see via telehealth. A few people also mentioned flexibility of scheduling and more frequent visits. So they were conducting nutrition follow-ups in between the formal CF visits. And that allowed for more time since it was just a nutrition visit as opposed to a full team visit. Also reduced exposure risk for patients, and the ability for the dietitians to work from home were some advantages reported. And now, what resources did y'all request in order to help with your CF nutrition assessments? And by far, again, back to the anthropometrics, it was a scale. So many people commented they wish they had a scale. And then following this, the other resources listed were all just one or two people kind of making some suggestions, some requests for technological equipment, as well as educational resources for patients taking their own anthropometrics, doing NFP on themselves, food insecurity, those were some ideas, and administrative report for scheduling was reported by one person. So switching gears a little bit, now what are patients and families saying about their CF virtual nutrition experience? I want to thank the 45 patients and family members who completed this survey, which was distributed to the CF Learning Network patient and family QI partners, and some of them also shared with their patient advisory councils. So about 30 parents of children with CF answered. So that was our most popular respondent, followed by 14 adults with CF and one other category, which is not a family or friend caregiver. So I'm not entirely sure who that individual was. And what did they say about their virtual nutrition experience? So about a quarter of them haven't yet had a virtual nutrition visit. And in the rest of the three categories, what I noticed here was a discrepancy with how dietitians felt. Whereas half of dietitians felt that virtual visits were worse than in-person, only 13% of patients and families felt that way. About a similar proportion, 9 for dietitians or 11% for virtual for patients and families felt that they were actually better. And then really the majority felt like they weren't necessarily better or worse. You know, there's qualities that are beneficial either way. And what did they feel were advantages to virtual nutrition visits? Well, we see a lot of the same themes, but the order is flipped around a little bit. So for patients and families, convenience and saving time and travel and the hassle of parking was by far the most common advantage reported. And they also did report, so this confirmed what the dietitians felt, is that they felt more relaxed and comfortable at home. They felt less anxious coming to clinic, and also lowered risk of exposure to germs, and the ability to show the dietitian pantries and medical supplies at home. And they also felt like visits were not quite as rushed. Now, what are some of the challenges patients and families reported? Similar themes, not having accurate anthropometrics and not having the dietitian visually see a patient's full body. There were also a few complaints about technology issues or not having a video visit with the dietitian, maybe only a phone visit, and a few children that felt like they weren't interested or got bored quickly. But then there were others who also reported that their children were more engaged from a home environment. So I think it really just depends. And what do they wish y'all knew about their CF virtual nutrition experience? Well, this particular question, it was harder to code the responses and categorize them because they were extremely variable. And actually, most of the responses didn't have to do exactly with virtual visits. It was just CF nutrition visits in general. Some indicated they prefer one-on-one visits. Others said they preferred team visits so they don't have to repeat themselves and it could go quicker. There were some appreciative comments and shout outs to dietitians. And then there were also a few critical comments, which were mostly about parents feeling tension with the dietitian on a child's weight gain or recommendations. And there were a few suggestions included for us. Someone suggested just more sensitivity when discussing weight. Focusing on nutrient quality rather than just calories and weight gain, which Juliana will be discussing in this session as well, and discussing food insecurity and safe grocery shopping during the pandemic. And finally, there was a suggestion that if you're somebody who has not been able to provide virtual nutrition visits yet in the CF setting, perhaps messaging families just to let them know you're still monitoring their children's weight or enzymes or just keeping an eye on their nutrition, that would be appreciated. So we're going to transition gears a little bit. We just talked about the experiences that people have had in telehealth and telenutrition in their CF care. And so now we're going to transition to talking about how can we use this to our advantage. And I have a quote I wanted to share with y'all from Max McCone, who is a British writer, researcher on the innovation strategy. And he says that adaptability is about the powerful difference between adapting to cope and adapting to win. And I was really inspired by this quote because I think in this unprecedented time, we all have a choice to make, whether in our personal lives or our work lives, about whether we're just gonna coast and hit the pause button and just try to survive this whole pandemic and all the changes and turmoil it's caused, or we can try to figure out a way to really thrive in this time and make the most of this time. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about the CF community is our resilience and ability to innovate and navigate change and achieve outcomes that were previously never thought possible. And that's why CF is a modern miracle in medicine. And so just wanted to encourage and challenge all of you to think about and maybe transition that perspective from dread of virtual nutrition visits, dread of COVID, to thinking, how can we use the tools we have now to make CF nutrition better than it ever was before? And so we're going to talk a little bit about some opportunities we have. And some of these ideas were borrowed from some of the articles on telehealth outside of CF that I'll be sharing in the resource page later on. For individual visits, so it sounds like many people are already doing this, but asking your patients to see their kitchen, pantry, vitamins, enzymes, maybe their tube feeding supplies. It's not conventional as far as what we would do in person, but maybe this is an opportunity to change the way we conduct CF nutrition visits and allow for that more thorough assessment. For those who need, maybe if you have a concern, you can even ask to set up an appointment to observe parent-child interactions at mealtime, when they're cooking or setting up tube feeds, if there's any issues with those things. Maybe we can coach them. So this, again, one of the big complaints is not having accurate anthropometrics. So maybe we can coach them on obtaining their own measurements, doing their own NFPE. And this is something our respiratory therapist is doing in our virtual clinic. She's actually supervising their PFTs at the beginning of clinic visit and coaching them through that process to make sure it's done accurately and that they have accurate results. So that's something that dietitians could consider as well. We can screen share web pages and handouts and easily send links via chat box in your virtual call. And so that's something that we couldn't do as easily before, that maybe will make products or information more accessible to our patients and families. And then finally, don't forget to keep the best of your in-person visits. And what that is that building connection, motivational interviewing, teach back, sending them, written information at the end. And so whatever it is that works well for you in person, if you're able to replicate it in the virtual environment, please keep doing that. I think that's one of the things that we found in our centers. We just tried our best to replicate our in-person clinic to virtual and then adapt and take advantage of whatever additional virtual things we could do. And that seemed to work really well for us. As far as group visits go, an opportunity we never had before, or at least not as easily, is to invite family members and care partners to join in a visit. And this is especially helpful if we're talking about children living in two separate households, that if, both dad's side and mom's side can come, join in the call, hear the same message, then that could be really helpful to have uniform care. Or maybe it's grandparents, or some other care partner, some other family friend, or nanny or something. And then beyond family members, maybe we can invite or include other specialist providers who maybe otherwise would be in a physically separate clinic, but if we're on a virtual call, that they might just be able to have the appointment at that time. And to be able to also reconvene and huddle in a virtual room after a visit, that the geographical barriers are now eliminated. And it's really just a matter of having that technology. So what can we do to leverage that? And finally, I'm really excited about the idea of group education. So we can host, or an example is that the Children's Hospital of Colorado GI Clinic actually started offering group gluten-free diet education for new celiac diagnoses. And that was really successful for them. They piloted that because of COVID. And so it got me thinking about, well, what would it look like for us as a CF nutrition community to offer these online nutrition classes for our patients? And it may be a lot for one center to handle, but maybe if we collaborate and share with other colleagues around the country, we can provide quality nutrition education resources and courses, live classes, or recorded for our patients, especially in light of the changing CF nutrition recommendations. I've had so many conversations with patients asking if they should still be eating the way that they have always eaten. And so this is a great opportunity to use our resources to provide that information to our patients. And maybe an education or peer support group for healthy lifestyle change. Our center actually did this in February and March. We had a 7-week exercise and healthy eating program. And we didn't anticipate COVID when we planned it, but fortunately, because it was all virtual for both providers and the patients, we were able to continue it just fine as COVID began. So now we're going to circle back a little bit to those common barriers that people mentioned. So as far as anthropometrics go, scales from the CFF or private grant funding? Is that something that, you know, we could consider asking for? And I know the CFF is offering home spirometers to patients, but maybe we could ask for scales as well. I know some people have gotten insurance coverage for scales, especially for pediatric patients, as well as enzyme patient assistance programs like Live to Thrive or CFTR Forward. They have been so generous to us in the past, and maybe we could add scales to those programs. And finally, the fortunate thing is scales aren't that expensive. So if the patients do have funds, maybe we can encourage them to purchase one. Could we offer either live instruction during visits or share a pre-recorded video? So Katie McDonald has generously shared her video for instructions on obtaining a child's height, and that's linked here. If there are tech connectivity issues, a low-hanging fruit would be a tip sheet for patients to help optimize their internet. So sitting closer to the router or turning off other Wi-Fi devices as examples. And then maybe dreaming big. Our center is trying to get grant funding and contact local providers, internet providers, to patients who otherwise can't access. What about lack of lab results? We can work with the physicians and nurses to try to develop processes for tracking and obtaining labs. And if we're unable to see patients, can we ask them to stand back a little bit, move back from the camera so we can see their whole bodies, have them do various tests on themselves for NFPE, or just asking the questions verbally, like whether they had skin or nail changes. Finally, here are some resources from the general nutrition world that are linked here for you all, and my references. And thank you very much. So that's my presentation, and I appreciate the time you spent listening here today. I'd love to hear from you if you want to chat in any questions or comments. I'll be periodically monitoring that throughout the conference.
Welcome to our on-demand nutrition discipline group session, Optimizing CF Nutrition Care in a New Era. And welcome to our speaker, Juliana Bailey. Juliana is a registered dietitian at the University of Alabama Adult CF Center. She's authored several book chapters on nutrition and CF and was a co-author for the recent Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence-Based Practice Guideline for CF Nutrition. Ms. Bailey is also currently pursuing a doctorate degree in health education and health promotion. For this segment, Juliana will discuss the available research on the impact of CFTR modulators on nutritional status. And we will occasionally monitor the chat throughout the conference, so please contribute to the discussion there. And I'll let you take away, Juliana.
Thank you, Jessica. So I have no relationships to disclose related to this presentation. And I wanted to start off this talk by going over nutrition and CF, particularly from a historical perspective. So as we all know, malnutrition has been the main issue in CF historically. Malnutrition in CF is associated with lower lung function and poor survival. And BMI has also been the main marker for nutritional status, although that is changing some with recent research. And there is what's known as the legacy CF diet, which is high calorie, high fat, high salt, and high protein. This diet has been based on little evidence, and we'll talk later about how some new evidence has come out that is shifting diet in CF. We're all aware that the landscape of nutrition in CF is changing. CF clinical care and drug therapies, particularly CFTR modulators, have rapidly improved longevity. And with this, nutritional issues are changing with the care advancements. And we're seeing new comorbidities and diseases associated with general population that are emerging in CF as life expectancy extends. So we've kind of gone from seeing mostly malnutrition to now seeing the entire spectrum of nutritional status in CF, from a BMI of 15 to some patients who are overweight and obese. And some patients in the adult world have BMIs over 30. And you can see in this graph on the right that I pulled from the CF registry that life expectancy has been steadily increasing since 1994, when the median predicted survival was age 31. In 2018, the most recent registry analysis showed that life expectancy was up to age 44. So with this, we have new nutritional challenges. Because this talk is on CFTR modulators, I wanted to take a moment to go over the CFTR mutation classes just as a brief review. So there are 5 classes, And in class 1, no functional CFTR protein is created. And the percentage of people with CF who have at least one mutation in this class is 22%. In class 2, the CFTR protein is created, but it misfolds, and that keeps it from moving to the cell surface. And delta F508, which is the most common CF mutation, is a class 2 mutation. And in class 3, also known as gate mutation, the CFTR protein is created and moves to the cell surface, but the gate is locked shut and it doesn't open properly to facilitate the electrolyte transfer. In class 4, CFTR protein is created and it goes to the cell surface, but the function of the channel is faulty. And in class 5, normal CFTR protein is created and goes to the cell surface, but it's in insufficient quantities. So I mentioned that CF care has advanced and longevity has improved, and this is largely due to CFTR modulators, and these treat the underlying cause of CF. So this is the first therapy to treat CF at the cellular level. There are 4 different CFTR modulators that are pictured here. All of us are probably very familiar with them, from Kalydeco or ivacaftor, which is the first one to come out, to the most recent, which is triple combination therapy or Trikafta. And these are genetic mutation-specific drugs. And with all of these drugs, we've seen improvements in lung function, quality of life, and with some of the drugs, we've seen improvements in nutritional parameters, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. I also wanted to go over the types of CFTR modulation therapy. We have both potentiators and correctors. Potentiators, like ivacaftor, work on cell surface protein channels to improve the chloride and water transfer across the cell. So these work when the protein is already in the cell surface. Correctors like tezacaftor and lumacaftor improve the structure of the CFTR protein and improve trafficking to the cell surface. And potentiators and correctors are used in combination in some of these drugs to both migrate the CFTR protein to the cell surface and then to help it function better once it gets there. So now I'll shift gears and I'll talk about CFTR modulators and the research on nutritional status and how these two things are related. I'll start by going over ivacaftor, which most of us know as Kalydeco. Several studies found significant weight gain in both children and adults who had at least one copy of the G551D mutation, and this is a class 3 gating mutation. Stalvey and colleagues also found improved linear growth in children with the G551D mutation. And this was very impactful because children actually had catch-up height growth when they started ivacaftor. However, there was only one study that examined body composition in ivacaftor, and it was only over a short duration of 4 weeks in this randomized controlled trial. And there was no significant effect on fat-free mass in adults with G551D mutations. There was also no significant effect on weight for age and BMI Z-scores in children who are homozygous for delta F508 mutation, which is a class 2. And the effect on BMI was not significant in adults who had at least one copy of R117H. For nutrition and ivacaftor with lumacaftor or combi, the effects of BMI were mixed in adults with class 2 mutations. There was no effect on BMI in children who were delta F508 homozygous. However, there was an increase in BMI for adults who are homozygous for delta F508. However, it's worth noting that baseline nutritional status was not reported in the study. The effect of body composition, the effect of treatment on body composition, and the effect of dietary intake were not described in the study. For nutrition and ivacaftor with tezacaftor, which is Symdeko, there was no change in BMI in children homozygous for delta F508, and there's only one randomized controlled trial conducted on Symdeko. Again, here the effect on body composition and dietary intake is unknown because it was not examined in this trial. So a recent systematic review of the effect of CFTR modulators on anthropometric parameters was published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. And to summarize, in participants with class 3 gating mutations, ivacaftor had significant effect on weight gain and linear growth in children and adults. Results were mixed with respect to weight gain on ivacaftor and lumacaftor in adults with class 2 mutations. And adults homozygous for delta F508 had significant increases in BMI on ivacaftor with lumacaftor. Children who were homozygous for delta F508 had no change in BMI on ivacaftor with lumacaftor. And there was no evidence available on the role of diet or how CFTR modulators impact body composition. And so what's all in our mind is triple combination therapy, or what we know as Trikafta. So Trikafta is for people with CF who have one copy of the delta F508 mutation. So this accounts for 90% of people with CF. And most all of us have a ton of patients that have been on Trikafta since November. We've seen improvement in lung function, both in the randomized controlled trials and in clinical practice. There's been significant improvement in body weight and BMI, although this has varied patient to patient. And the long-term effects of Trikafta on nutritional parameters are currently unknown because the drug is new. But there is a multi-center observational cohort study called the PROMISE study that is assessing multiple different organ systems across time on these patients that are using Trikafta in the real world setting. And I am currently conducting a nutrition sub-study at University of Alabama at Birmingham to assess the nutritional and metabolic impact of Trikafta use long-term. And we're looking at the effect on energy expenditure, dietary intake, and hand grip strength. So we're hoping to have this study completed by the end of this year, but there's currently no data to present. I just wanted to make the point that there are studies ongoing to examine the real-world effect of Trikafta on nutritional status. There's some limited evidence on how the oldest CFTR modulator, ivacaftor, affects weight and the potential mechanisms of weight gain with this drug. So for mechanisms of weight gain, there has been one study conducted on ivacaftor, which is the oldest CFTR modulator. Virginia Stallings and her group conducted a study in 2018 where they examined adults and adolescents with CF who had gating mutations that took ivacaftor. They took baseline measurements of resting energy expenditure, absorption, gut inflammation, and body composition, and then they measured things again at 3 months. And what they found was that there is a statistically significant decrease in resting energy expenditure. There was improved absorption on fecal elastase and coefficient of fat absorption, and they also found decreased gut inflammation. And in this graph here on the right, you can see the relationship between resting energy expenditure and fat-free mass in kilograms assessed by whole body DEXA, which is the gold standard for measuring body composition. And they are separated out by pancreatic status groups. So the pancreatic insufficient patients are black solid circles and solid lines at baseline, and they are open circles at 3-month follow-up. The pancreatic sufficient patients are gray solid squares and solid lines at baseline, and open squares and dashed lines for 3-month follow-up. So rested energy expenditure adjusted for fat-free mass was lower in patients with pancreatic sufficiency. Total energy expenditure and the total energy expenditure to resting energy expenditure was not significant overall. However, in patients with pancreatic insufficiency, coefficient of fat absorption improved significantly with treatment over 3 months. So the same group also examined dietary intake changes on ivacaftor using 3-day diet records. Again, they measured adults and adolescents in both Italy and North America at baseline and then 3 months on ivacaftor. And here are some of the results from their study. You can see this graph here on the left shows percentage of estimated energy requirements consumed. And it's separated out by the Italians and the North Americans. And the dark gray box is the baseline measurement, and the light gray box is the 3-month measurement. And you can see in Italians, they had a statistically significant increase in their caloric intake expressed by percentage of their estimated energy requirement. North Americans did not. They actually had a minor decrease. And then over here in the graph on the right, they did the same analysis for dietary fat intake in grams per day. Again, the dark gray box is baseline and the light gray box is after 3 months on drug. And you can see again in the Italians, there is a statistically significant increase in fat intake. So this increase in fat intake and total calories was noted after 3 months, and the increase was also correlated with weight gain. It's worth noting that CFTR modulators are recommended to be taken with a high fat or fat containing meal. So this may also partially contribute to improvements in weight on the drug. I also wanted to talk a little bit about absorption and ivacaftor because this has been a very hot topic lately as far as how it relates to enzyme use and CFTR modulators. So there's limited evidence on everything except ivacaftor, but I wanted to show you the Kiwi and the Climb trial results. And these were open label extension studies of ivacaftor in children aged 2 to 5 that had gating mutations. And one of the outcomes to measure exocrine pancreatic insufficiency was fecal elastase in these children. And so the Kiwi study occurred from baseline to week 24, and then the Climb study extended to 84 weeks. And you can see here that pancreatic elastase levels slowly improved over the course of the Climb study. And up here, they continue to improve out to 84 weeks. And I believe that 7 out of 16 patients by the end of the Climb study had a normal pancreatic elastase level. So these studies indicated that there was some recovery of pancreatic function in children aged 2 to 5 who took ivacaftor. So as I mentioned, Kiwi and Climb assess pediatric patients on ivacaftor only. There's been limited assessment of absorption changes in adults on modulators, with the exception of Virginia Stallings' study that we talked about a few slides ago. And her group found that fecal elastase improved significantly in pancreatic sufficient adults with gating mutations who were taking ivacaftor, but there were no significant changes noted in adults with pancreatic insufficiency taking ivacaftor only. I also wanted to talk briefly about body composition in ivacaftor because body composition has also been a hot research topic in CF. We know that BMI has been the historical marker of nutrition status, but with all the research that's come out, we know that we need to look beyond BMI and look at things like fat-free mass, which are associated with higher lung function. So there's limited evidence on body composition in modulators. Edgeworth and colleagues found no change in fat-free mass after 28 days on ivacaftor, and they used bioelectrical impedance analysis to measure body composition. In contrast, Virginia Stallings and her group reported an increase in both fat mass and fat-free mass using DEXA after patients had been on ivacaftor for 3 months. So it's worth noting that bioelectrical impedance analysis may over or underestimate fat mass and fat-free mass in people with CF, and this may contribute to the differences observed in these two studies. It's also worth considering that it may take longer than 28 days to observe significant changes in body composition on these modulators. So in conclusion, the impact on growth in anthropometric measurements is dependent on CFTR modulator formulation and the person's genetic mutation. Effects of CFTR modulation therapy on body composition and dietary intake are unknown. Best practices for dietary prescriptions and adjustments to pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy in the setting of CFTR modulators are also not known. More research is needed to fully understand the effects of combination therapies on nutrition status in all classes of CFTR mutations. And I think this is a really wonderful opportunity for us as dietitians to get engaged in research and conduct more studies so we can more fully understand the impact that these life-changing drugs have on our patients' nutritional status. And as Jessica mentioned, I will be taking questions throughout the chat along the conference, and you can also engage with me through the app, but I put my email address here too in case you want to email me and have a discussion offline. And I look forward to hearing from all of you and discussing. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana, for a wonderful session. As she mentioned, if anyone would like to discuss with her any further, please connect with her on the networking platform. I also encourage everyone to log in to Juliana's next presentation, where she'll provide practical tips for managing nutrition on CFTR modulators. Thanks, everyone. For this segment, our speaker, Juliana Bailey, will discuss practical tips for managing nutrition on CFTR modulators. We will occasionally monitor the chat throughout the conference, so please contribute to the discussion there. And I will let Ms. Bailey take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. So I have no relationships to disclose related to this presentation. And I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about nutrition in CF from a historical perspective. So historically, as we all know, malnutrition has been the most common issue in CF. CF actually used to be referred to as cystic fibrosis of the pancreas, and this is because CF mortality used to be due to malnutrition prior to pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy. Nutritional therapy involved a low-fat diet to control steatorrhea, but this changed in 1988 when Corey and colleagues found that patients at the Toronto CF Center had a longer life expectancy than patients at the Boston CF Center. And when they did a comparative analysis between these two CF centers, the only real difference they found was that people with CF in Toronto consumed a very high-fat diet compared to people with CF in Boston who consumed a fat-restricted diet. So this is really where the classic CF diet recommendations have come in, was from this one study. We all know that the legacy CF diet is high in calories, high in fat, high in protein, and also high in salt because of the sodium and chloride losses through the skin because of CFTR dysfunction. And typically the legacy CF diet has tended to be higher in trans fats and saturated fats because back when life expectancy was much shorter, people did not live long enough to see real consequences develop from consuming a diet that was high in saturated fat and trans fats. But we know that this is changing a little bit now. Our current practice in nutrition care, again, is the high calorie, high fat diet, but there are no specific guidelines on the types of foods recommended to meet the high calorie needs of people with CF. And many of the high calorie foods that are recommended are low in nutrients and high in saturated and trans fats, which we know can be pro-inflammatory. And we also now have this emerging issue of overweight and obesity in CF as longevity increases and treatments improve. So we've all probably observed in our clinical practice that the landscape of nutrition in CF is changing. And you can see here on these graphs that I pulled from the CF registry that nutritional parameters are steadily increasing. So this graph over here on the left is median nutrition outcomes for children with CF, and we have BMI, height, and weight. And you can see that over the past 10 years, between 1998 and 2008, all three of these parameters have steadily increased. And BMI has increased to above the 50th percentile, which we know is the CF Foundation goal for children with CF. We see the same trend over here on the right with median BMI values for male and female adults who are 20 years of age and older. Both men and women have had steadily improving BMI over the course of the past decade. And you can see also that adult male and female BMI is now above the CF Foundation recommended goal. And if this trend is to continue over another 10 years at the same pace, we'll see a lot of overweight and potentially obese people with CF. So advances in treatments and drug therapies, particularly CFTR modulators, have led not only to extended longevity, but to rapidly improving nutritional status. And we're now observing the entire spectrum of BMI in people with CF, from malnourished to overweight and obese. So I really wanted to talk a little bit more about modulators and nutrition status. If you watched the last talk, you were able to see what the research says on these topics, but I wanted to show you some things from clinical practice to illustrate the response, the variation in response to Trikafta among adult women in our CF center. So the first woman was 44 years old. She has CF and pancreatic insufficiency, and her baseline lung function was 45%. She started Trikafta shortly after it was approved in November of 2019. And you can see here that she's mostly always been a little bit above the CF Foundation goal, but not quite overweight. And she might have had a modest weight gain when she first started Trikafta, but she's essentially maintained her goal BMI status since being on Trikafta. Contrast that with a 23-year-old female who has a baseline lung function of 49%, who also started Trikafta in November, and her baseline BMI was close to 16, so she was pretty severely malnourished. And you can see that she had a huge rapid weight gain between November and June of 2020, and her BMI was almost up to 21, and she was on trajectory to hit the CF Foundation goal in a few more months. And then we're also seeing this. This is a 24-year-old female with cystic fibrosis and pancreatic insufficiency who has a higher baseline lung function of 99%. She started Trikafta at the end of December. Her BMI has always been a little bit overweight and was hovering around 25 when she started Trikafta. She also had a rapid increase in weight, and her BMI accelerated to above 32 by June of 2020. So this was an unintended and unwanted weight gain that pushed her from being overweight status into obese with no changes in her diet or exercise regimen. So you can see that there is quite a variation in response to Trikafta. Some patients don't have a profound weight gain. Some patients do have a profound weight gain, and that can either be a good or bad thing. So we've discussed the landscape in CF nutrition is changing. So we have new recommendations and new dietary guidelines for CF that were put out by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Evidence Analysis Library. And I wanted to provide a brief summary of those because they're a little bit different than the legacy CF diet. And if you watch Dr. King and Dr. McDonald's talk on these new guidelines, you'll be familiar with this, but I just wanted to provide a brief summary. So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics advises a diet consistent with recommendations for the general population, but that it's modified for individual needs and preferences since there's no evidence to suggest that routine modification from the general recommendations improves outcomes. They also recommend promoting an unrestricted diet that emphasizes foods that are associated with positive health outcomes, which include things like fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, meats and poultry, and seafood. And people with CF without risk of malnutrition should consume a diet similar to the typical age-matched population with respect to macronutrient balance of carbohydrates, fat, and protein related to their total calories. So this is quite different from the one-size-fits-all, high-calorie, high-fat CF diet that we've been recommending for quite some time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what a healthy high-calorie diet might look like and some of the changes that we can help our patients make when they need to make changes. So both of these diets are 3,000 calories, and high-calorie diets do not have to be high in fat, but we've often recommended that for our patients because of Corey's study and because fat is higher in calories, so that just made it easier to get the extra calories in. But some of our patients don't tolerate high-fat diets due to GI issues. So if high fat is right for a particular patient, it doesn't have to be loaded with saturated and trans fats like we have over here on the left. There's a way to work in more monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats like the diet on the right. And when we think of the high-calorie CF diet, we're typically thinking of the hamburgers and pastries and chocolates and cookies and fries and all of these yummy high-calorie foods that might not be the healthiest. And many patients, especially adults with CF, have been encouraged to kind of eat whatever they want their whole lives in order to gain and maintain their weight and pack on the calories in whatever way they could. And life expectancy was not always so good, so the consequences of a diet high in saturated and trans fats and added sugars kind of paled in comparison to the consequences of severe malnutrition in CF. Many adolescent adult patients are having to shift almost overnight from eating a diet that is high in fat and saturated fat to eating a healthier diet. And that's a really hard change to make when they've been conditioned to eat high calories since they were really able to make dietary decisions of their own. So the question for us as dietitians now becomes, how do we shift from the diet on the left to the diet on the right? How do we help our patients make those changes effectively and in an empathetic way? So I wanted to talk a little bit about strategies for tailoring dietary intake. And first, I wanted to talk a little bit about partnership in care. We need to hold the judgment and listen to our patients because it's really hard to form a therapeutic relationship with someone if they feel judged and we don't create a space where they feel open to be honest with us and have a productive conversation about changes that are realistic and that can fit into their lives successfully. And it's very important to listen to our patients' lived experience because while we have the expertise of evidence, they're the ones that are living with the disease every day. So I can't emphasize this first point enough. And if you take nothing else away from this talk, know that there is no one-size-fits-all diet for CF. There really never was, but now there's especially no one-size-fits-all for CF diets. And for patients that do need to make dietary changes due to unintentional or unwanted weight gain or any other dietary changes they may need to make because of modulators, things should be done in a small incremental fashion. We can't overhaul a diet overnight because that sets people up for failure and disappointment. Some patients might require a reduction of fat content in their diet to aid in weight loss or to attenuate weight gain. And we may be able to reduce the amount of fat taken with CFTR modulators. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. It's also important to talk to patient about readjustment of portion sizes, which again is a very hard shift to make, especially because some of these modulators can cause increased appetite. It's also important to encourage physical activity. And if you have a physical therapist at your center that works with your patients, this is a great time to partner with them in coming up with exercise regimens to go along with the nutrition care plans that we come up with. And as always, it's really important to tailor recommendations to a patient's preferences and their lifestyle to make sure that it works for them and to make sure that we're co-producing our nutrition care plans. So I mentioned that taking modulators can increase the fat content of the diet, and that's because modulators need to be taken with a fat-containing food. Some patients have told me that they're taking their Trikafta with up to 20 grams of fat or sometimes 25 grams of fat twice a day, whereas before that was fat that they didn't have in their diet. So that's significantly increased some of the calories. However, the package insert for Trikafta suggests that it only needs to be taken with 8 to 10 grams of fat. So it's been helpful to counsel patients that they can reduce the fat content of their diet a little bit when they're taking Trikafta, which are oftentimes extra high fat snacks. So I won't read all of these to you, but I wanted you to have this as a resource. And these are foods that can be taken with modulators that are closer to 8 to 10 grams of fat rather than that 20 to 25 grams of fat. Then I also wanted to give some examples of how we can adjust a diet to be healthier or lower in saturated fat when necessary. So this is an example of reducing the fat content and adding in healthier fats for a patient that might need that. So instead of tacos with ground chuck and sour cream and cheese and a cup of queso with chips, we could try tacos with ground turkey, reduce the portion of the cheese, use Greek yogurt in place of sour cream, and then add in avocado and black beans for some healthy fat and protein, and maybe do salsa in place of the queso. And then again, I won't go through this in its entirety, but I've also put an example of a healthier high-calorie diet meal plan over here. And you'll notice that this does still include foods like eggs and bacon that have saturated fat in them, but it's in much lower amounts throughout the day than what would have been typically recommended for somebody with CF in the past. Again, it's making those slow incremental changes and not cutting out people's favorite foods. I also wanted to provide some healthy snack ideas. This is more of a shift to eating snacks that have fat but are higher in polyunsaturated and monosaturated fats rather than the saturated and trans fats. So this would include things like nuts and nut butters, maybe dried fruit, hummus and vegetables, avocado on wheat toast, or Greek yogurt with a low sugar granola. And again, I like to think of snacks as mini meals that contain fat, carb, and protein. And these are just some examples of healthier options for patients. So some of our patients have been on supplemental nutrition because they needed to gain weight. And I'm sure we've all seen patients that were on tube feeds or large amounts of oral nutrition supplements that found that they had a really rapid weight gain once they started Trikafta or other modulators. So if rapid weight gain occurs, it would be good to recommend weaning the tube feeds. And the wean rate will depend entirely on the individual patient and their rate of weight gain. Some patients may require a slower wean if they want to stop tube feeds, whereas, if somebody who's gone from a BMI of 25 to 30 needs to stop tube feeds, we can probably stop them very quickly. But I also think it's important to consider having a period of weight maintenance before pulling a G-tube, just because even if a patient has gained a lot of weight and seems to be doing well from a nutritional perspective, if they get sick, there's potential that they could lose it all very quickly. So the period of waiting before pulling the G-tube will probably vary from individual to individual, but that's just something to consider. And then with oral nutrition supplements, that's also something that can be weaned if someone has rapidly gained weight or if they have met their weight gain goals. And I know pancreatic enzymes are a really hot topic right now, and patients are wanting to decrease them, patients are wanting to stop them, some patients are needing to increase them. There's just a lot going on, and I've seen a lot on the CF listserv about people asking what to do about decreasing enzymes, so I wanted to address that a little bit here. The current recommendations and the A&D guidelines that were recently published were to continue enzyme therapy until there's more research on withdrawal of enzymes and how that impacts patients. So with that said, some patients are going to reduce and stop their enzymes. That's just something that is going to happen and has happened. And it's important to, again, listen to your patient and hold the judgment. And if your patient is reducing or stopping their enzymes, talk to them about why and let them know that increased monitoring will probably be required. And there are also some lab measures that can help us in making decisions about reducing or stopping enzymes. Those include retesting fecal elastase once someone's been on a modulator for a while. You can also do 72-hour fecal fat collections to assess the coefficient of fat absorption. And it's also important to continue monitoring fat-soluble vitamin levels, because if someone decreases or stops their enzymes, there's a potential for them to develop micronutrient deficiencies if they have background malabsorption going, even if their weight is normal. And I also wanted to make the point that some patients have actually required enzyme increases, and that's particularly when the fat content in their diet is increasing, either with taking that fat-containing food with a modulator, or if the modulator has improved their GI function, that they've found that they tolerate fat better, they're able to eat more of it. We've definitely had some patients who have reported an increase in oily and greasy stools and have required enzyme increases just because they're consuming so much more calories and fat. So again, there is no one-size-fits-all approach here, and we need to partner and care to come up with collaborative plans and goals with our patients around enzymes. I also wanted to talk a little bit about vitamins. It's important to monitor these levels and base decisions on whether or not to keep vitamins going depending on an individual's lab values. And if a patient does decide they want to stop taking their CF-specific vitamins, then it's important to recheck their vitamin levels in 3 months to make sure they're not developing any deficiencies. And it's currently unknown how modulators affect vitamin status. There's just not a lot of data out there on that. There are also some GI side effects with modulators, particularly we've seen with Trikafta. And I wanted to go over that a little bit because I know this has also been a hot topic on the listserv that people have been discussing quite a bit. Again, there's no one size fits all with this. People are having very individualized responses. Some are having loose and watery stools. Some patients are getting constipated. Some patients alternate between those two things, and then others have an increase in steatorrhea or malabsorptive symptoms. So this is a great time to collaborate with the pharmacist on your team or other providers if additional medications are required to address the GI issues that come up on modulators. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some nutrition strategies. Whatever strategy we use as dietitians will obviously correspond with the symptoms that patients are experiencing. But for constipation, we can increase fiber and fluid in the diet. For greasy stools, we can optimize enzymes. We can also use Miralax for constipation. And I wanted to note that it's important to avoid making multiple changes in enzymes in a short amount of time, especially while a patient's experiencing GI symptoms as a side effect of modulators, because this can really muddy the waters when we're trying to assess our interventions and what's happening. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on body image and the emotional effects of unintended and unwanted weight gain that can come along with modulators. So obviously, I think we've all seen that body image issues can occur in both men and women if they've had unintended and unexpected weight gain, especially if it's rapid. We've talked to a lot of patients who have gained a lot of weight and then had difficulty losing weight, even if they've made dietary changes and exercise changes. So it's important to take an empathetic approach to nutritional counseling and also to promote body positivity and encourage patients to be kind to themselves. And again, this is a great time to partner with social work, your mental health coordinator, and psychiatry and psychology to address these issues in a collaborative way, along with including the patient in all of the decision making. And the CF Foundation actually has a wonderful packet on body image in CF, and it talks about a lot of different things, including like scars from ports and PICC lines, but there is a section on weight and body shape. So this is also a really good resource to give to our patients that are struggling with body image issues. So in conclusion, nutritional management of people with CF is changing rapidly as life expectancy extends. And dietitians should co-produce customized nutrition care plans with patients and families around nutrition therapies, including dietary intake, supplemental nutrition, tube feeds, vitamins, and enzymes. And there is no longer a one-size-fits-all CF diet. RDNs should promote an individualized approach to dietary intake recommendations. And interdisciplinary collaboration with the CF care team is crucial to help patients achieve their personal nutrition goals in the era of highly effective CFTR modulators. And again, please chat in with your questions or reach out to me through the conference platform. And I've also included my email here if you want to talk offline about any of this. And I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you for your time.
Hello. Welcome to Optimizing CF Nutrition Care in a New Era, the evolution of CF nutrition care. International guidelines inform the future of clinical practice. I am sincerely grateful to Dimitri and Susanna for joining in this discussion. Dimitri de Klerk has a Master of Science degree in Healthcare Management and Policy. He's a PhD candidate and an academic assistant at the Ghent University Hospital in Belgium. He is a co-author of the 2016 ESPEN ESPGHAN ECFS guidelines on nutrition care for infants, children, and adults with CF. He was a co-chair of the European CF Nutrition Group and a member of the ECFS GI Nutrition Scientific Group. Dimitri works as a dietitian in the Centers for Cystic Fibrosis and Pediatric Endocrinology at the Ghent University Hospital. He's an active member in the Flemish Association for Dietitians and Diabetes Liga. His main hobby is dancing Cuban salsa and bachata moderna. Dr. Susanna King is an accredited practicing dietitian with over 25 years experience in clinical nutrition. She is currently senior dietitian for respiratory and CF services at the Alfred Hospital, Melbourne, Australia, which provides care to over 350 adults with CF. Susanna has played a key role in the nutrition guidelines for cystic fibrosis in Australia and New Zealand. She is an associate editor for the Journal of Cystic Fibrosis and the allied health representative of the Australian Cystic Fibrosis Data Registry Steering Committee. In Melbourne's extended stay-at-home lockdown, Susanna has been doing lots of cooking, gardening, and keeping fit with Zumba at home. She's looking forward to salsa and bachata lessons from Dimitri. I'm Katie McDonald, clinical dietitian at the Pediatric CF Center at Primary Children's Hospital in Salt Lake City, Utah, USA, for about 30 years. I was a co-chair for the CFF enteral feeding guidelines and the chair for the CF nutrition guidelines, recently released in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I'm a ballroom dancing fan, but I'm also looking forward to Dimitri's salsa and bachata lessons. Thank you very much. We have no disclosures. The objectives. Participants will be able to compare and contrast existing international CF guidelines and provide feedback for the next iteration of these CF guidelines. Why are nutrition guidelines needed for CF? They provide scaffolding for consistency in practice, standardizing evidence-based nutrition guidelines, empower clinicians to achieve optimal results for the individuals they serve. It informs nutrition management for individuals with CF from infancy through an advanced stage. Guidelines support orientation and induction of new staff to CF nutrition care. They help service review or quality improvement efforts by improving nutrition practice among clinicians, also advocating for adequate staffing. Accreditation is important and guided by these nutrition guidelines. Internationally, to share information and knowledge in countries with emerging CF nutrition care and differing healthcare resources. Guidelines are important to identify gaps in knowledge and suggest potential research opportunities. Dimitri?
Thank you, Katie, for the really nice introduction. So the European guidelines, the process was launched by the European Society of Clinical Nutrition and Metabolism in an international group of dietitians and physicians, all experts in CF. They went systematically to the literature, and at time of writing, there was a lack of trials that examined the effectiveness of nutritional interventions in CF, and therefore most of the recommendations are based on consensus expert opinions. But although with the existing literature, we outlined the guideline as follows. We wrote a part on epidemiology and the pathophysiology of malnutrition and cystic fibrosis, then a part on the prevention of CF-related undernutrition and the treatment of CF-related undernutrition, mostly stressing the use of enteral nutrition and sip feedings and mealtime behavior. So the guidelines of 2016 were actually an update of the 2002 guidelines. And for the 2016 version, we used the grade system as a methodology, where the methodology is written by Price and Schneider, and that is published in Clinical Nutrition. The methodology used a grade of evidence, which are the number of studies and the type of research studies. Then the strength of recommendations was based on the consensus of the members. And then all the recommendations were sent out to all the ASPEN members for approval or disapproval. And at the final step, the guidelines were reviewed by the European Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology and Hepatology and Nutrition and the European Cystic Fibrosis Society. So next slide. This is an overview of our general guideline statements that were written out throughout the guidelines. So it's important to screen all newborns and initiate nutrition management as early as possible. A regular assessment of the anthropometric parameters in all age groups. Then a regular measurement of specific nutritional, functional, and disease-related markers as predictors of nutritional risk. Then we recommend an individualized and age-appropriate nutrition education to prevent or delay nutritional deficits. We recommend an advice on macronutrient balance, especially protein and fat, to prevent or delay loss of muscle mass and function. And we recommend specific criteria for action to assess and treat underlying causes and ways to treat deficiencies, for instance, in the CFRD case. Although, while doing our literature research, we also found that there was a lack on interventions that studied the use of fatty acids, the anti-osteoporotic agents, the use of anti-inflammatory agents, anabolic therapies, or probiotics in cystic fibrosis. So I think we will move on to our Australian colleague, Susanna.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Katie, for the lovely introduction. And the nutrition guidelines for cystic fibrosis in Australia and New Zealand were released in 2017 and also part of a planned update from the previous guidelines, which were 2006. Over 45 dietitians from both countries, together with CF clinicians from a range of disciplines, contributed to the guidelines development, which was supported by Dietitians Australia, Dietitians New Zealand, and the Thoracic Society of Australia and New Zealand. And that very wide reach of involvement is believed by the authorship group of the guidelines to be one of the key reasons for the very widespread uptake of the guidelines, ground up and owned. So the guidelines were released in printed form with a nice book, whose picture you can see on the top left-hand panel, which was distributed locally. But the PDF is very freely available to download from the Thoracic Society website, either as an entire document or chapter by chapter. The guidelines encompass a wide range of nutrition and nutrition-related topics and are aimed at being informative to both dietitians and to others in the CF care team. And the chapter outline is shown on the bottom right-hand box on this slide. The guidelines include topics that had not previously been covered in any major CF nutrition guideline, including overweight and obesity, nutrition aspects of genetic modulator treatments, such as we knew by 2017, complementary therapies and probiotics. And they also include one of the most comprehensive outlines of nutrition management of lung transplant in CF. They serve as an advocacy function with recommendations on dietetic staffing for CF. So the structure of the guidelines is that they encompass both graded evidence-based recommendations, but where sufficient evidence did not exist, provide guidance through a structure of what's called practice points. And this is actually a structure that was supported by our peak body, the NHMRC, in the way that guidelines are to be developed. And that also allows for the upgrading of those practice points to evidence-based recommendations if that's sufficient evidence in the future. And it's also supported by a strong narrative to make the document practical for both assessment and intervention. So some of the impact of these guidelines over the last 3 years is that, as well as their utility in the clinical setting, the document has been widely used for clinician education, CF service audit, review, and service development planning. And also the nutrition status classifications in the guidelines have been integrated into the annual data registry reporting for Australia, which is also very important in terms of harmonisation. So we're now entering the planning stage of the next version of these guidelines, which is due in 2022. So we're getting started later on this year. Thank you. And next slide, and over to Katie.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Dimitri. I'm going to be speaking about the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics guidelines. These were released earlier this year. They provide a systematic review of the literature to provide recommendations specifically for registered dietitian nutritionists delivering medical nutrition therapy to individuals with CF. And they look for gaps in current evidence-based guidelines on crucial topics to improve health and disease prevention. These guidelines were specifically written to complement and not duplicate the other CF guidelines, specifically Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, and then guidelines also from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. The evolution of dietary requirements and other therapies are advancing quickly. That's no secret. Undernutrition is becoming less common, and there's a need for individualization for energy requirements, diet quality, and metabolic health. Some of the highlights from the CF nutrition guidelines from the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics include 28 nutrition recommendations, including screening, assessment, intake, and RDN staffing. It recommends the use of normal nutrition guidelines, such as those issued by the USDA or the CDC, as a basis for nutrition management in CF. One of the things that I like best is a topic table that's found within these guidelines that refers to the other guidelines and where information can be found. Dimitri, back to you.
Thank you. So as we move forward together, how can guidelines help dietitians to provide nutrition care to patients with very complex problems? What are our expectations of guidelines? What else can support the management of complex scenarios outside the scope of guidelines? When does a rare scenario become more common so as to justify being addressed in a future guideline? And to what extent can and should guidelines help direct and prioritize the research agenda in CF nutrition? Now we move on to Susanna.
Thank you. And as we move towards the end of the presentation, we have some questions to pose that we hope will stimulate you to think about what future CF nutrition guidelines might look like, whether you're a user of the guidelines or whether you're also part of a development group. We hope that you will take up this discussion through the chat function and also through the CF Nutrition Listserv. And of course, in person, when we can all meet again at conferences, hopefully in the not too distant future. So firstly, how should future guidelines be approached? Do we continue the historic approach of the all-encompassing guideline covering all aspects of nutrition? We know the considerable advantages of having a well-thumbed Bible that dietitians use again and again. But these types of guidelines have been enormous projects to develop and update, and therefore have taken quite a long time. And should we rethink that approach and move more into individual topics, such as enteral nutrition, vitamins, modulators, improving diet quality, and the like? And perhaps in some ways, with the US guideline that Katie outlined, with that reference across to different guidelines where they particularly wanted to avoid duplication, that may actually provide some of that springboard for saying, well, this aspect of nutrition, there's a different document that you refer to. And do we concentrate on nutrition only, or do we expand it into our cross-disciplinary reach by weaving nutrition guidance into guidelines addressing the broader topics, such as modulators, CF-related diabetes management, end-stage lung disease management, or lung transplant, and the like. The second key question to ponder relates to the question of is more international collaboration on nutrition topics desirable? Historically, the guidelines have been focused on individual countries or regions, but is now that time to broaden internationally? Does this approach enable more rapid updating of guidance and to avoid duplication? Or are the differences between regions, healthcare systems, resources, and treatment priorities so great as to preclude this international collaborative effort? Next slide, Katie. So this slide just shows the references for the key guideline documents. And in looking, there's 4 dot points there for 3 documents, but it represents an enormous body of work. And we would like to thank and acknowledge every person, professional and consumer, who has contributed in some form to the many guidelines that inform our practice and have helped CF Nutrition Care to advance and respond to this ever-changing world that we find ourselves in. And finally, we would like to thank you for listening to our presentation and hope that you can continue the dialogue through the chat forms and listservs. Thank you.